Right. Fair few folks here now, so I guess we could get into it. Hi everyone. My name is Varun. I'm part of the DX engineering team here at Chromatic. If you're new to these sessions, I started this format a few months ago. Usually just go through and demo a particular feature or a task that you might complete with Chromatic. So mostly I'll be going through a demo that I've set up. It's meant to be pretty informal, so please feel free to interrupt me at any time to ask questions. You can drop them in chat. And then I usually leave a whole bunch of time at the end to answer any questions that you might have about the stuff we are talking about today or general grammatic stuff. I'll try my best to answer questions. Sometimes I might not have an answer, so I'll follow up with you guys after the session. Yeah, so today I want to talk specifically about portal components. So stuff like dropdowns, dialogues, tooltips. How do you go about testing them with Storybook and Chromatic, and some of the challenges that you might run into when testing those components with Chromatic, and I'll sort of walk through how to address those challenges. So let me share my screen. Cool. So when I say portal components, this is kind of an example where straight from the Chromatic website, the header, when you hover over it, this little dialog pops down with a menu, or if I go into tablet mode, I can open up this tablet menu. Um, so what I'm going to do is talk about how to trigger such components inside Storybook. So generally, in order to show a tooltip or a dropdown, you need to have some kind of user interaction. So I'll talk about how you use play functions to trigger these components, and then what you have to do to make sure that you're snapshotting these components correctly in Chromatic without things getting cut off. Cool. So let me start with a bit more of a simple case of a info tooltip. So relatively straightforward. Maybe I'll zoom in a little bit. You hover over the little icon here, and it shows the tooltip to the user. And let's just reset the viewport. So uh, how do you actually trigger something like this in the Storybook? And there are a few different ways to do it. You might have a component that just takes a prop that shows the tooltip, but generally, at the end of the day, it's the user interacting with it, though. So the user is hovering over it or focusing on this icon, and that's what triggers the tooltip. So uh, we can do that using play functions in Storybook. So let's look at some code of how to do that. Starting with the tooltip. So this is the stories file for tooltip. And what you can do is to a story, you can attach something called a play function. Um, and what a play function is a little bit of code that executes after the story has been rendered. And then in that snippet of code, you can write interactions. So things you might do in a component test using things like tools like testing library or jest, um, and even run assertions like expect something to be in the DOM. So very simply, let me just log this canvas element here and show what that looks like. So if we look at the console now, you can see it's logging the root element. So that's the canvas element. So within this play function, Storybook gives you access to the root node where stories are rendered, which is this Storybook root element. Uh, cool. So if I want to trigger this particular tooltip, what I need to do is find whatever this element is and focus on it, because that's kind of how this bit of code or this tooltip works. Um, so if you've ever written tests with Jest, retest, testing library, um, uh, this API will be very familiar to you, and the reason for that is Storybook actually uses those tools under the hood. Storybook Test is a wrapper around Jest or retest, depending on which version of Storybook you're using, and then testing library. So first thing we're going to do is scope all of our queries to, and it's very helpful. So let's just, AI can be too helpful with code sometimes. So let's just take it step by step. So we're going to start by grabbing, using the canvas element to scope all of our queries to just within that element. This makes it easy to go find stuff within the story. Otherwise, you have to, you can use screen to find something within the screen, or like you might have to write more targeted queries, but I find this makes things much easier. And then what we're going to do is look for a button. Okay, within the story. So this is the button that's this icon. If I inspect this element, you'll see it is in fact a button that renders an icon inside it. And then the last thing I need to do is actually call focus on it, because that's what triggers the tooltip. So if I do that now, you can see now suddenly when I go to the story, the tooltip is highlighted. Let me go to a different story and come back, or the alert dialog. If I come back, you can see the tooltip is highlighted, whereas previously I had to manually interact with it to get it into that stage. If you still interact with it, it will continue sort of executing like or behaving the way the component is meant to behave. You can just hit the retry button to get it to work. Wonder why it's not showing up in the interactions tab here. Let me just restart my Storybook server in case that's causing something. I had this running for a while, so it might have just gone out of sync or something. Not sure why it's not showing up here, but usually you're supposed to see the interactions show up in this panel here. Yeah, not sure why, but anyway, so the idea is you're writing a test that is triggering this this particular tooltip. Cool. So now that I have set up that interaction test, the next step is to run visual tests. And what Chromatic does is it will actually wait for this particular interaction to finish. So whatever you have in the play function, it will first wait for the story to render, then execute the play function, and then run a visual test. So why don't we go ahead and run some visual tests. And in this case, I'm using the visual test add-on. This storybook is already linked to my Chromatic project. I could use the CLI, I could use the GitHub Actions, or just use the visual testing add-on to run a bunch of tests. They're all kind of equivalent in this case, just because we're going to be running a bunch of tests. Instead of jumping between different tools, I'm just going to run them right here inside my storybook. While the tests are running, any questions about play functions? All right. If not, I'll just give it a. Sorry, there's one question here. Oh, so the question is, we use user event.focus when interacting with elements instead of calling the dot focus on the element itself, which is the more preferred method. Honestly, I'm not sure. I suspect that user event.focus might be a cleaner API since it plugs into testing library, but I've generally used the dot focus function on the element itself, and it seems to work fine in most cases. So unless it's not working fine, you might have to switch over. But yeah, otherwise I think it's totally fine to use either, to be honest. Oh, I see. So user event will blur previously focused elements out. Okay, that's very helpful to know. Thanks. Yeah, I think generally with focus stuff, it tends to be in like pretty simple scenarios where you're focusing on one element, but with form, if you're filling out a form and you want to trigger validation, so things in that case, it might be very helpful to have the blurring stuff built into it. Cool. So while that I was going through that, the test actually ran, and this is what the snapshot looks like. So it might be a little bit hard to see, but the snapshot is just simply capturing the icon and not the tooltip itself. Um, Now, why is that? If you've if you sort of use Chromatic, you might have or attended my last session, you might have uh, encountered the new sort of tooling that we have built into Chromatic, which gives you traces of the Chromatic builds. So if you use that, you can use it to verify whether the interactions are running or not. In this particular case, I do know for a fact that the interactions are running, but the reason why it's clipped just to the icon is um, by default, when you're running visual tests with Chromatic, Chromatic tends to look at whatever is the content inside the storybook root element. So that's this element here. And if I rerun the interaction, you'll see the root element just has the button inside it, whereas the tooltip is actually inside a portal. So that's why I'm focusing on these components today. It's because with portal based components, generally the idea is you're rendering some kind of UI that is going to be detached or not in the same hierarchy as the element that's triggering it. Usually tends to be placed somewhere within the body tag as like the last element because you want it to be above everything else on the page. And when that happens, uh, what Chromatic will do is it'll capture a snapshot and then it will try to trim the snapshot to just the contents of Storybook root, which is why this element, the tooltip itself, gets excluded because it's not inside Storybook root. So the way we can fix that is by adding a decorator. And it's a pretty sort of straightforward decorator where all you're doing is wrapping the story inside a div and then setting some kind of dimensions on it. So let's say uh, maybe, yeah, I think that's probably good enough. The 200 pixels and 250 pixels. And what this is going to do is it's going to force the root element to be a little bit bigger. So if I refresh, you'll see the root element is much wider and a little bit taller. So width is something I'm less concerned about just because Chromatic does sort of account for like the full width and then starts trimming down. But height is the big one. So we want to have a little bit of a height here so that we can capture the full contents of the story. So let's run the test one more time, see what it looks like this time. And then depending on the contents of your story, you might have to tweak the size that you'd use for the decorator. So that's something you have to do currently, but something that we are experimenting with the next version of Chromatic's Capture Cloud is we're going to try and start detecting pieces of UI elements that are within a story but rendered outside the storybook root element. So Chromatic will try to detect those elements and automatically trim based on that. Um, currently, it doesn't do that because initially when Chromatic was set up, our goal was to just trim whatever is inside storybook root. So, well, that's something we need to that will likely be handled automatically for you in the future, but for the time being, you do have to wrap your stories in a decorator. Okay, so this is where you can see the 200 by 250. Not quite enough to capture the whole thing, so let's just tweak this to increase the width to, let's say, 450 pixels. The other thing is the layout is padded, which is why the tooltip is showing a little bit up above the button. So you know, it's your choice. You can sort of add a little bit of padding. It's just going to make it higher. So, or just remove the story padding if you want to, so that now everything is within the bounds of the story. So let's try running this one more time. Uh, Again, while these tests are running, any questions so far? And if not, that's totally cool. We'll just give it a. Oh, the question is when should we see that update? So sometime in the next couple of months. We're currently working on Capture Cloud version 7. Just started doing internal testing. Once things stabilize, we should start rolling it out. Yeah, so in the next couple of months, I would say. Cool. Here's the updated snapshot, and you can see now the entire tooltip has been captured. Um, Again, in this case, because the positioning is sort of to the top, there's like it really gets to the edge of the UI, so the top border is a little bit cut off, but you can play around with the decorator and to move things around a little bit more. So that's one example. I want to show a couple more examples. So I have another component here for a dropdown. In this case, I have a whole bunch of stories. We start by just rendering the trigger button by itself. There's light and dark variants. You can change the icon and then also get it to open up. And even and then there's just various scenarios where some items might be selected or some items might be ignored. So um, uh, the idea here is you're focusing on the button, then the user has to either click on the button, or you can use keyboard navigation to hit enter, and then use, let's try this one, and then use up and down arrow keys to select different items. So if I go to the source for this one, this is what the play function looks like. So kind of similar to the first one where we're looking for the menu button, starting by calling focus. And actually, you know what? Why don't we try uh, the API that Narendra mentioned? So let's try to focus with menu button. Hmm, Maybe I'm using an older version that doesn't have that API, so that might be the reason here. So in that case, let's just stick to what I had initially. And then the last thing we're doing is using user-event.keyboard to fire enter. So I'm using the keyboard version to trigger. Uh, to be honest, if I try click on the menu button, that should totally work too. Yeah, that works too. But the reason why I'm using keyboard event here is because then we can also move and select one of the other items down below. So if you want to do that, you would do something like arrow down. So this should move down to the second item now in the list. And if I do one more, it's going to move down to the third item. So super helpful. Oh, hey, and interactions are working in this story. I'm not sure why they're broken on this story. Maybe I just have some uh, bug in my code. But anyway, uh, you can see all the interactions in our play function are listed out here. So find this particular button, hit enter to open up the dropdown, and then move down to select the third item. So in this case, I had already set up the decorator, so the visual tests are capturing the entire dropdown as expected. Oh, okay, sorry, I just saw Narenda's message. It is in fact user event.hover. So let's try that. Actually, I'm not sure that's going to trigger it in this case because the menu in this case is triggered by click only. It's not by hover. So with focus and then you do enter, that works. So in this particular case, that is probably not the right thing because you really do want to focus on the menu button in order to trigger it with the keyboard event. But yeah. So this is another example where we're relying on a slightly different API to trigger this particular portal, but the bit with the decorators is kind of the same as before. Let's look at one more example. So like in this particular drop-down menu, again, very similar to the one I just showed you. Let's look at the play function for this. Yeah, actually almost exactly the same. And in this particular case, there is a light and dark variant of the story. So what you'll notice is I've defined the play function and the decorator just once, and then you can copy it over to the other story. But to be honest, like this this is applying to every single story within this particular file. So you can totally just move it up to the meta object, and now uh, it should use the same decorator and play function for all of them. So you don't have to repeat it. Um, in the previous example, I didn't set it at the, I did set it at the meta level, so the play function, so it's applied to all of them. Um, but uh, I also reset it for, or set the play function to just an empty function for a couple of stories because the closed variations, we don't actually want to trigger it. So that you can mix and match it depending on sort of how you want to do it. I noticed another comment from Miranda here around using click. Yeah, totally. That's one of the examples. I briefly showed it, but yeah, you can totally find the menu button and press click on it to get it to open up. That's another way to do it. And in fact, we're gonna do that in the next example, which is the dialogue. So in this particular case, uh, the trigger, again, you find the button, click on it, that opens up the dialog, and then you might have more stuff within the dialog to complete the test. You might look even like check to see if the user can click on the yes or no button, and does that update the UI in a particular way. But let's write let's look at the play function for this one first. So again, at this point should be pretty similar. So canvas, start by scoping the queries to within the canvas element, then looking for the button, and then using button.click. Or to be honest, the better API would be user event.click, and then passing in the button element to it. And generally, good idea to use await for most of these actions. Some testing library actions are asynchronous, like all the get by APIs tend to be synchronous. If you're using find by, that's an example of something that is asynchronous. You would have to you would have to await that particular call. User event click, I forget if it's synchronous or asynchronous, but for the play functions, our recommendation is to try and use await as much as possible so that Chromatic is not skipping over any of your actions. So again, if I go back to the story, it's working as I expect. And if you look at the interactions tab, it's pretty straightforward. You're looking for, it collapses all of those calls into one for this particular interaction, but essentially we're looking for element with the roll button and the triggering click on it. Okay, cool. Um, I briefly mentioned earlier that you can also throw in assertions into your play function. So why don't we add an assertion here to check to see whether the dialog is open or not? And before I do that, just want to show something. So you'll notice this dialog has a particular role set to it, so role alert dialog. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to first click on the delete account button to open up the dialog, and then we're going to check to see whether this alert dialog has been added to the DOM or not. So the way we do that is dialog is canvas get by role dialog, and then let's expect dialog to be within the document, and I need to import the expect object from storybook test. Cool. We ran that, and you'll notice that the interaction is failing. So it's not able to find uh, any element with get by role dialog. And again, this is this is where, because we're using portals, that's why the query is failing, because the initial query is within storybook root element. And again, if you look at the storybook root element, that's up here, and the dialog is in fact a sibling to it and not a direct descendant of that node or any descendant of that node at all. And that's why you're not able to find that dialog. So the way you address this is, instead of using canvas get by role, you instead use screen get by role. And I need to import screen here. Cool. And you'll notice that it is still failing. Uh, the reason for that is the way this dialog is triggered is you click on the button, and then the dialog is popping up. So it's not in the DOM instantly. It takes a while for it to actually get added to the DOM. And get by role is a synchronous check, and that's why it's not able to find the dialog right away. So this is a really good use case for using find by role, which is an asynchronous check. So essentially, find by is a combination of get by and wait for in testing library. So you wait for until you get a get an element by that particular of whatever particular query that you might mention. So if you use find by, that's a shortcut to do something like that. And now if I run it, our interactions are working as expected, or it was for a brief moment, and then it failed. Oh, right. Yeah, sorry. That's a great catch. Looking for the wrong role. Thank you, Diego. All right, there you go. So we're able to find that element, and it is in the document. So now our interactions are working as expected. Yeah, so just to recap, we had to change a couple different things here. So one, we had to use screen to look for our element, and then secondly, use the find by query instead of get by to isolate, but to be able to wait for that element to appear in the DOM. Cool. Uh, let's actually run visual tests for this particular story and see what they look like. Oh, actually, I did run them already, and you'll see it's just scoped to the button. And that's because I don't have a decorator for this particular story. So let's add one in. I'll just copy one in from here. And let's just set it to 400 by 400 pixels. Unfortunately, because I triggered a test run already, it's gonna wait for that to complete before we rerun it. So just bear with me for a couple of minutes while this is running, and then we'll rerun the tests. Okay, let's run it one more time. And again, while those tests are running, happy to answer any questions that you might have. It should just be a couple of minutes for this test to complete. And then we should be able to see what the snapshot looks like. All right, there you go. So this is what the snapshot looks like. Um, it's just clipping a part of the page. So if I look at the story, so I set a 400 by 400 pixel um, decorator to it, and it's just clipping a part of it. And again, that's because that's the area that we're configuring storybook root to. So what's happening here is, because this dialog is rendered within the center of the viewport, we need to adjust the decorator a little bit more. So instead of using some random value, we actually need to set this to 1200 by 900. And the reason for that is the default viewport size that Chromatic starts off with. So when Chromatic renders the story um, in the cloud browsers, it's going to set it to that particular. It starts with that particular viewport, and then it starts trimming down depending on the UI that's inside it. So now that I set it to 1200 by 900, when this test runs, it should be able to capture the entire viewport this time. Um, and you're like, why? How do I know that that's the default viewport? We do mention it in the docs, but that's so one way to do it is just by setting it to that particular number or any sort of large enough number that covers the entire UI that you want to capture within the snapshot. And if it's larger, then that usually works. And depending on the UI, might get trimmed down a little bit more. All right, so here's the snapshot coming in, and you can see now the entire dialog has been captured within the snapshot. So that's one way to do it, where we're wrapping the entire view, or we're wrapping the story in a particular decorator with that's sort of large enough to account for the viewport. The other thing is you might be testing the UI across multiple viewports. So, for example, this header that I showed earlier. Uh, Actually, if we open up the Visual Test tab for this, this gets tested across multiple viewports. So it's showing view mode around 1200 pixels. Actually, the tablet one is a better example. So yeah, this one has multiple viewports. So we tested on 320 pixels, 640, 768, and 939 because the layout changes slightly. So want to be able to test the component across all those viewports. And the way this is configured is using something called modes. So if you're using viewports inside Storybook, you can map them to modes inside Chromatic, and then Chromatic will test this same story across all the modes that you specified. And I can show you what that looks like. Let's look at the header stories, and it's the tablet open story. So in this particular case, I've I specified a bunch of viewports. This is using a slightly older API where it's just it's using you can just list out a bunch of viewports. But if you have, for example, in this case, we have configured the viewports add-on inside the storybook. I could also use modes to specify all which modes I want to test this story in. So that's a pretty handy API. And then again, let's see. This is the decorator that's wrapping the whole thing. So in this particular case, I'm not setting a width. I'm just letting the story render at whatever sort of intrinsic width it is, and that is constrained by the viewport to a certain extent. So we're not doing that, just the height, so that the entire menu gets captured by that particular height. Cool. One last thing I wanted to mention was around animation. So quite often with these portal components, you end up having a little bit of an animation that to have these things appear onto the screen. If those animations are CSS based, Chromatic automatically lets the animation run and pauses at the final frame and then captures a snapshot. So CSS animations get handled automatically, and that's why for all the tests that I showed you today, we didn't have to add any kind of delay or do any kind of special thing for animations. If you're using JavaScript-based animations, using like Framer Motion or some other uh, library of that sort, you will likely have to disable animations, and most of those tools tend to offer some kind of API. So you can use isChromatic to check whether it's a visual test, and essentially what it does is it skips the animation and just goes to the final point, final state of the UI. And then lastly, if you're using a library that doesn't allow that, you might have to just set a delay, or the technique that we use for this particular component where we waited for the alert dialog to be in the document. That's another good technique where you're just waiting for something to be mounted, and you're checking that thing is mounted within the DOM, and then Chromatic will capture the snapshot. So either adding a delay in the play function, or just using the chromatic parameter to add a delay, or using some kind of assertion to make sure things are the way you want before a snapshot is captured. Well, I think that pretty much covers everything I wanted to share today. Any questions before we end for the day? And if not, like I said, I will send out a recording for this session likely sometime tomorrow. And if something else comes up, you can always reach out to us either through support, or if you want to reach me personally, you can find me by email at varun@chromatic.com. Cool. I doesn't look like we have any questions. In that case, thank you all for joining today. And I'll see you next time. Thanks a lot. Bye.